3 weeks ago in our monthly elders meeting, I invited everyone to share what first comes to mind when they hear the word wisdom. These are some of the words that members of the elders and pastors group shared: gentleness, peace, yieldedness, Gelassenheit, humility, restraint, listening, presence, vulnerability, seeing beyond self, different than knowledge, and perhaps the most accurate, we need more of it. Several of these words, gentleness, peace, yieldedness, are specifically used in the text from James 3 that we heard a couple of minutes ago. To the notion that we need more of it, we should be reminded of an opening phrase to the book of James. If anyone lacks wisdom, he or she should ask God, who gives generously and without finding fault, and it will be given to you. I was looking ahead to the lectionary text when I asked that question, and I was eager to have the elders and pastors help to write the sermon, because I'll take all the help that I can get. I said, however, that I would not name any of them. Now, I have a coffee cup that some of you might have noticed that I use in fellowship hall. It says on there, "Be careful what you say, you may appear in my sermons," but not to be this time. But what occurred to me was, in listening to those words, I wondered, how would it be different if we asked that question of different age groups in the congregation? In other words, how might younger people answer that question? What comes to their mind when they hear the word wisdom or wise? Is wisdom only achieved by age or experience? What's meant when someone says she is wise beyond her years? How does life experience factor into achieving wisdom? On the other end of the life continuum, is it possible to be an older adult and not be wise? There's an old Pennsylvania Dutch saying, "Too soon old and too late smart." Maybe we could paraphrase that to say, "Too soon old and too late wise." On the other hand, most of us, as we are aging, if we're honest, would say, "The older I am, the less I know." Thank goodness, knowledge and wisdom are not synonymous. In my home community, there was a man known as Lippy Joe. Now, when there are multiple Joe Millers, like 10 of them on one rural route, you have to have nicknames. So Lippy Joe was one of those. I don't know for sure how he got that nickname. But in the days before compulsory school attendance for members of the old order Amish community, Lippy Joe was asked, why did he drop out of school after grade 3? Well, he said, "I went to school one day and teacher said 1 + 3 is 4. And I went to school the next day and the same teacher said 2 + 2 is 4. And Joe said, "I figured that until she makes up her mind, there wasn't much use in me staying in school." Now, it's clear Joe was a little short on knowledge, but I honestly don't know if he was wise. All I know is he had a sense of humor. But he might have been a wise person. I was just too young to really know that for certain. Dr. Francis Collins, first-rate scientist and evangelical Christian, in his new book, The Road to Wisdom, suggests that the path to wisdom involves truth, science, faith, and trust. And we heard some of those words in the children's story. Collins reflects on an experience of lab research early in his career where 9 months of work went down the tubes, so to speak, because of failures that he had made in designing the research project. He was so discouraged, he actually thought about giving up his career as a researcher, thought about leaving his lab, And in his disappointment and despair, he became aware that experienced researchers had all had similar stories to share of failed scientific experiments. In other words, failure and mistakes were the foundation of future breakthroughs, or one could say failure and mistakes were the foundation of future wisdom, because they in fact learned from those failures. And with the support of those mentors with whom he tested his assumptions, he became an international leader of the famous now DNA Genome Project, which has revolutionized medical care. And many of us remember that he concluded his years of service as head of the National Institutes of Health. Dr. Collins grew up in Verona, just south of here, in the Shenandoah Valley, and he worked alongside Dr. Fauci in leading the nation's response to the COVID crisis. He used those experiences of failure in order to continue his career, and I would suggest became a very wise person who guided us during a very difficult period of our history. In his book, he says, "I have never encountered a situation in which my scientific and faith worldviews have been in serious conflict." There are numerous markers of wisdom. I've already named a couple, but I'd like to focus on three: vulnerability, humility, and self-reflection. Wise individuals are vulnerable, but not necessarily in the ways that some in our society experience vulnerability. Being vulnerable to violence, for example, physically or emotionally, is not wisdom. Being vulnerable economically through no fault of one's own is not wisdom, but an economically poor person may indeed be a wise person. And a person of great wealth does not mean he or she is wise. There's another kind of vulnerability that wise individuals possess: the capacity to acknowledge one's limitations, to say, "I don't understand. I need help. You have gifts that I cannot bring to the table, and together we are stronger than what I am alone." The author and historian at Calvin University, Christian Kobe Dumais, in her book Jesus and John Wayne, makes the case that in our culture, males, particularly white males, have been socialized in ways that protect against vulnerability. It's a toxic masculinity that's infecting our nation and the Christian church in profound ways. Always be in control. Don't cry. Be strong. Take charge. Be like the cowboys who conquered the Wild West. Don't tread on me. Be like John Wayne. At its most pernicious rendering are the memes depicting Jesus with an AK-47 slung over his shoulder. And that's not an isolated scene. Several years ago, a member of Congress sent out his annual Christmas card with his family sitting in front of the Christmas tree, each of them holding an assault weapon that was created for war. I'm still trying to wrap my head around that one. Those pictures of tough Christianity, toxic masculinity, as I would depict it, hardly align with the life and teachings of Jesus and the upside-down kingdom. But it's a bit more complicated than simply being a meek person as taught in the Sermon on the Mount, in what is almost oxymoronic. It takes enormous psychological and spiritual strength to be vulnerable, to not respond viscerally to aggression with violence. And let me be very clear. The invitation to vulnerability is directed primarily to those who possess power and knowledge and privilege. To voluntarily acknowledge one's limitations rather than exerting inappropriate power is a marker of wisdom. A second marker of wisdom, closely related to vulnerability, is humility. The gospel text for this morning in Mark paints a picture of what humility looks like on the ground, honoring the other because they are created in the image of God. The first shall be last, and the last shall be first. Many years ago, Pat and I were in a Sunday school class at the Evangelical Free congregation we were attending. Bob Miner was the teacher. I still remember exactly where I was sitting in the balcony of that small church as I heard him explain the biblical meaning of humility. It was new to me. It was a new idea. As he put it, humility is internalizing the truth that I am no less than, nor better than, any other human being. We are all created equal in the image of God. That was a new thought to me, as one who was quite familiar with what I would call worm theology. For such a worm as I was a phrase that we sang frequently in my childhood. And that theology was stressed in many sermons. Thinking of myself as equal to others was a new thought, and my first assumption was, that sounds really arrogant. Concurrently, however, being reminded that I am no better than others was a necessary antidote to the primary impulse of our highly individualistic society. Contrary to a common misconception, humility is not synonymous with groveling, nor is it akin to weakness. It's an honest and realistic expression of our shared humanity, regardless of status, citizenship, nationality, religion, wealth, or gender, and regardless of any descriptors by which it's easy to demean others and strip them of their God-given dignity. And in our current national debates, we see this most obviously in our acceptance or rejection of immigrants, or even more diabolical, our treatment of immigrants from particular parts of the world. Achieving that elusive balance of genuine humility is not easy, and on a given day, it's possible to go off the rails on either side. To mentally compare ourselves to others, I have more worth than him or her, or my value will never measure up to hers. When I was in the 7th and 8th grades, I attended the public Mid-Prairie Junior High. Our grades were divided into 4 sections, A, B, C, and D. I was in the C section. At the time, no one ever explained how it was that they came up with those designations. All I knew was that the A students were at the top and the D students were at the bottom. And I was in section C, which meant that I was below average. Lake Wobegon was in Minnesota, where everybody is above average, but in Iowa there are people below average. That affected my self-esteem and my assumption about my academic capacity. And then just a few years ago, probably 40 years after that experience, I learned the truth about how students were placed in those 4 sections. For scheduling purposes, any student who played a musical instrument was automatically placed in Section A. You just had to do it so that the schedule would work. Students whose test scores fell in the bottom 1/4 were placed in Section D. And the remaining half of the class, the 50 percentile in the middle, were arbitrarily placed in Sections B and C. And for the first time, I realized that had I played a musical instrument, I would have been placed in Section A no matter what my test scores were. And it was theoretically possible that one's test scores could have been at the top of the chart and still be in section C. Now, to be honest, that wasn't my case. I didn't play a musical instrument, and my test scores were not, I'm guessing, off the charts high. But nevertheless, all of that impacted how I thought about myself. And I know, based on how those were assigned, that I could have been placed in section B, and that would have changed my self-perception. So along with being steeped in worm theology and several other factors, being placed in section C by the luck of the draw only added to low self-esteem at that age, particularly as it related to academic work. But at least I was being humble. There's an ironic twist to that story. By virtue of being in Section A, those students also had the best math teacher and most difficult math classes. And one of the great math teachers lived around the corner from us and knew our family. He's still living, and he's kept in touch with my career. And more than once, he has reminded me that he remembers teaching me in math and implies that I was a very good student. It never happened. But I haven't had the nerve to correct him. Humility is seeing ourselves as we really are in the eyes of God, equal to, no better than, no less than any other person created by God. A third marker of wisdom is self-reflection, or putting it more simply, learning from experience. And one could argue that this only comes from life experience, but that's not always the case. Children and youth and young adults all have the capacity to learn from past experiences, though it may come more naturally with additional years. I didn't grow up on a farm, but I was around farm equipment all my life as the son of a farm implement dealer, and in my teen years I worked on a lot of farms baling hay. Intellectually, I knew that farm equipment was dangerous, but experientially, that hadn't quite sunk in. Until one day, a close friend of mine and I were pulling a baler, and behind that baler was a full load of hay, several miles going back to the barn. It was a small tractor. Now, for those of you, and I know there's very few left, but for those of you who know anything about farm equipment history, this was a Case 300, which was about the size of a current garden tractor. I was driving, Rich was sitting on the fender, long downhill gravel road, at the bottom of which was a one-lane bridge. You can imagine what happened. I didn't gear down, and about halfway down the hill, we started to lose control. Rich was able to look back, and he could see the hay bales flying off the wagon on both sides of the road because it was fishtailing. I am literally standing on the brakes of that tractor trying to get that thing slowed down, and both of us can see this narrow one-lane bridge ahead of us with a pretty deep river on either side. Somehow, by God's grace, we slowed down enough before we got to that bridge to go shooting across the bridge. And then, of course, on the other side, we met the farmer coming the other way. And he saw all the bales that had been thrown on the side of the road above us. I have flashbacks to that near-death experience every time I'm driving on an interstate highway or any long downhill grade and I see those graded pathways for trucks that are out of control. My memory goes right back to that experience. I learned from that experience. Didn't make me wise overnight by any stretch, but I learned from it. And that self-reflection, learning from experience, I think is illustrative of what I mean by being on the path to wisdom. It takes courage. It's a lifelong journey. Vulnerability, humility, self-reflection, each of them critical markers on the path to wisdom, each of them prone to being unbalanced. Vulnerable individuals can be victimized. It's possible to be falsely humble or to struggle with low self-esteem. And self-reflection can be a never-ending journey of so-called navel-gazing, wallowing in the mistakes of the past. And I confess that that's a real temptation for me. There are days, actually mostly nights, in the dark of the night, when I wish my memory of past interactions or hurtful things I've said was a little more fuzzy, because I can rehearse them in excruciating detail ad nauseum, and then dig an even deeper hole when I realize that in some cases I'm not even aware of the hurt that I caused. Just yesterday, I heard a neuroscientist explain that there's an area of the brain that is the center of rumination. It actually lights up, it flashes when we ruminate on the past. Interestingly enough, that same center of the brain lights up when we think about the future, ruminate about the future. The road to wisdom is winding and sometimes bumpy, and there's always the possibility of growth. Thanks be to God.